Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is Keiser Report Special Summer Solutions Edition with Max and Stacy. And today we welcome Professor Steve Keen. He's the author of Debunking Economics and the author of a brand new instant classic available for pre-order right now, The New Economics, a Manifesto.
You know, one of the very first episodes ever of Keiser Report back in 2009 was with you. You were one of our first ever guests. That was in the midst of the worst part of the global financial crisis of 2008 through 2009 or 10. You were debunking neoclassical economics at that time. Nobody listened to you. They're back to listening to neoclassical economics. So tell us, what is exactly neoclassical economics and why do you have such a problem with it?
It's one of two ways of looking at how the economy operates, which is to say it's all about the objective value of things, so the amount of time it takes for something determines its value, et cetera, versus the neoclassical, which says, no, it's actually the subjective satisfaction, utility one gets out of something that gives it its value. So the previous attitude was from the classical school of economics and the physiocrats before them. And fundamentally, they would say the use value of this chair is the fact that I can sit in it, whereas the neoclassical would say the utility of this chair is how comfortable it makes me feel. Now, when you're working in terms of the objective number, I can say how many hours of labor, how many ounces of steel went into making this thing, et cetera. They're all known measurable quantities. When I talk about the utility and it's subjective, I might find this chair more comfortable than you might, Stacy. And there's no way to really compare the satisfactions we get out of them. Now, if you think that might give you a bit of a problem in doing mathematics, it does. And that's what's actually happened to neoclassical economics over time. They started what looked like a sensible foundation of saying, the supply and demand, the scissors of the supply and demand curve determine price and quantity. And they then tried to build backwards from that the mathematical foundations while going forward in terms of how they model the economy. And unfortunately, all the backward work failed. Every last important mathematical principle they needed to apply did not apply. They were wrong. But they've built this huge edifice, this giant juggernaut of intellect that has taken over how people think about capitalism. And that's what they've rolled forward. And it's no damn wonder it didn't see the financial crisis coming, because it doesn't live on this planet. It can't happen here. So that's, in a very, very broad sweep, that's the problem with neoclassical economics. It's a fantasy model of economics dressed up in what I call mythematics, and they think as mathematics.
Let's take a look at this contrast between classical economics and neoclassical economics. So classical economics would include Adam Smith, who is part of the Enlightenment, who coined the phrase the invisible hand, which would indicate that prices are derived through market action, and that
no, in fact, it doesn't, Max.
Well, let me finish my question.
Yeah, sure.
And then neoclassical economics, which would include Keynes in that group, believe
Keynes
more
from trade and so on.
Believe more in the pricing to be set by a central authority, a committee, a group of people, a group of academics, a group of mathematicians.
Funnily enough, they've ended up in that situation. They've literally had to pretend there's a benevolent central authority who distributes income before we all spend. And they need to make that assumption so that they can explain the downward sloping market demand curve. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. So they actually started up with a model of a pure free market economy. And to make the model work mathematically, they've got to assume there's a benevolent dictator who reallocates income before we go shopping. And everybody is happy with the reallocation that benevolent dictator brings about. That's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Drabur theorem.
The benevolent dictator being the absence of a market function, right? So for example, in the Soviet Union, there was a benevolent market maker, a dictator, a guy who said this is the price of tractors, and the country collapsed. Under Adam Smith, they said, well, let's let the market decide prices, and it was part of the Enlightenment, which gave us the United States, right? So it's a difference between having a market price discovery and having a benevolent dictator market discovery, right? Isn't that the fundamental difference between classical economics and neoclassical economics?
It's the difference between classical economics and, neoclassical economics and reality, because obviously the market system sets the prices here. and obviously the market reflects the distribution of income and wealth and power. And they don't like that. They wanted to argue that everything was determined in a very fair way, what they call the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. So the only way they could get that result ends up by assuming exactly the same effect as having a benevolent dictator. And Max, you've got to read this stuff to know how crazy it is. And unfortunately, that's been one of my fates in life, having to read these original neoclassical texts. And they have gone so far up the rabbit hole of thinking that this is an accurate and mathematical model of the economy that they've made various twists and bends along the way, which is totally absurd. Like, for example, assuming that there's a benevolent dictator allocating income before trade takes place. That was Paul Samuelson in 1956. Okay, so they've got themselves caught in logical conundrums, and their way out of it is to pervert the entire analysis of capitalism, which is what I want to bring back, which is the dynamic and non-equilibrium monetary system we actually live in. And yes, the market system plays a fundamental role, but it behaves in a completely different fashion than the supply and demand analysis that neoclassicals think of.
So you mentioned reading the text of the neoclassical economists. You do provide a lot of quotes in your book. I've read a few of the first chapters. So wrap your head around that. But I want to read one of your quotes there, because you mentioned equilibrium and how their mathematical models basically say that it's always in equilibrium, right? That they're focused exclusively on equilibrium. So I want to bring up a good point here, especially when we're looking at all these interventions by the Fed in order to make, creditors whole, in order to keep markets, stock markets climbing, in order to keep house prices climbing. So you wrote, quote, "The obsession with equilibrium as a mathematical state of the economy has led to exalting it as desirable as well. Certainly, as I explain in the next chapter, the financial instability of capitalism is a serious weakness. But as Schumpeter argued almost a century ago in 1928, instability is one of the strengths of industrial capitalism, not a weakness. It leads to the innovation and change that is the essential strength of capitalism compared to other systems. The fact that the system is out of equilibrium all the time is partly because of and partly the motivation for entrepreneurial activity." So this whole notion of zombie banks, zombie corporations, zombie everything, it seems to arrive out of the fact that, so you're saying they have to stick to this model that all is in equilibrium.
Yeah, they do, and to do it, they actually leave out the existence of money. Actually, a bit of fun, Stacy. Search on Google for Paul Krugman Masterclass, and you'll see a little 47-second promotion where Krugman sells the course he's giving in that masterclass series. And as part of it, he says, what's it all about? He said, it's about people, it's not about money. So that's their analysis of capitalism without money. And that's, that's like, bodies without blood.
Capital.
I mean, it's crazy, but that's what they've done.
Right, capitalism without capital. But
effectively,
So let's look at something here. I'll give it an analogy. It's a seesaw, and on one end of the seesaw is a 500-pound man, and at the other end of the seesaw is a 100-pound man. And the 500-pound man is sitting on 99% of all the wealth. The 100-pound man has 1% of the wealth. It's obviously not an equal system. However, the neoclassical economists will find that point on the seesaw that achieves equilibrium, and now therefore they'll say the system is sound. So it's almost like a post hoc rationalization of the system. They'll say, in other words, the system is broken, but the neoliberal economists, neoclassical economists come in and say, well, we'll find that point on this unequal seesaw where there is equilibrium and claim that this is somehow rational, right? So it's coming after the fact. They're not actually describing how economies work. They're describing how to rationalize the broken economy.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, the term you've analogy given is a brilliant one, Max, for what's called the Pareto optimal situation. And as well as defining like an overall, they think, optimal situation for the whole of society, they'll say where we are, to get from where we are to somewhere else, the best place we can get to is where nobody can be made better off without making somebody else worse off. And so they define that situation you've just given a beautiful analogy for, of where, the seesaw is, 20% the fat guy and 80% the thin, to balance out the imbalance in their wealth, or 99 and 1 in the real world. Also, that's Pareto optimal. Sorry, we can't help out the 99% who are poor, because we'll have to make somebody in the 1% who's rich less wealthy. That's Pareto optimal. Isn't that nice?
So then we're not talking about economics. You're talking about propaganda.
Fundamentally, that's what they've turned into, and they're not even aware of it. And this is what I also discuss in the book. It's easy enough to explain why the wealthy might like neoclassical economics as a defense of a highly imbalanced system, as you've given that analogy for. But it's why economists themselves in love with that. Most of them, and I must say this is from meeting thousands of economists over my life, most of them actually believe they're doing good, and most want to do good. And they think they're doing good by making the real world look more like their economic textbooks. Now, they don't realize they're behaving like zealots, and they have a false vision of how the economy operates. They gloss over those bits because the overall picture is so beautiful to them. But the trouble is, it's like one of those diamonds where if you tap it on a particular point, the whole diamond shatters. And neoclassical economics is full of those flaw points. So if any particular thing is acknowledged, like, for example, that money matters, as soon as you acknowledge that, the rest of the edifice falls over. If you acknowledge that the income distribution affects aggregate demand, it falls over. So there's so many ways that fragility, combined with what they see as the beauty of the diamond before you shatter it, that's what they hang on to, and they're basically religious zealots.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, part 2 of our interview with Steve Keen, author of a new book, The New Economics, a Manifesto. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time to continue our conversation with Professor Steve Keen. He's got a new book coming out. You can pre-order it. It's called The New Economics, a Manifesto. We were talking about classical economics versus neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics gets taken to the woodshed, I would say, by Steve Keen. The fact is that they try to explain all the inequalities and nonsense that we have in our current system after the fact. And as you point out, none of their studies include money. Now, I want to give another analogy here. When I was a kid, a Christmas tree, under the Christmas tree would be a cool toy. And I would rip open the package and I'm like, oh, wow, this is a cool toy. And then I look at the package and it says batteries not included. And I'm like, oh man, I need a battery. Now, isn't this kind of similar? Because here's a model that the neoclassical economists give us. It looks really pretty, but money's not included. Battery's not included. It doesn't run. Steve Keen.
Absolutely. I mean, their model, like everything else, is a pair of intersecting curves, supply and demand. They tend to draw the money supply as a vertical line and say that's under the control of the government. So if the government sets a certain quantity of money, and you'll see this in Mankiw's textbook, for example. And then there's the demand for money, which slopes down. I've got to go the reverse way to show on your camera, I think. But downward sloping demand, the higher the interest rate, the lower the demand. And they say, well, the government moves the supply by the central bank, but the demand curve includes the demand from the government sector. So if the government sector demands more money by borrowing money to cover a deficit, that drives up the interest rate. And that higher interest rate reduces the amount of private sector borrowing, and that causes a decline in investment, therefore a recession. That's their model about the effect of the government running a deficit. And you'll see this, and then they say the government has to borrow off the private sector to finance its spending, and that the debt puts an unconscionable burden on future generations. Again, that's quoting Mankiw. You look at the real world, and government spending as a deficit puts money in your bank account. If the government spends more on you than it taxes you, you've got more money in your bank account. So a deficit creates money. It doesn't add to the demand, it adds to the supply of money. And then to finance that, when you look at the bank in terms of assets, liabilities, and equity, when the government puts money in people's deposit accounts, it simultaneously puts identical amount of reserves in the bank's assets. And then it offers them treasury bonds. On reserves, they don't earn interest. On treasury bonds, they do. They can't trade reserves. They can trade treasuries. They buy them. And that is a it's like it's not financing at all. And as you and I would be borrowing off a bank, it's simply letting the banks make money out of the reserves they've got by turning them into bonds. So that vision completely inverts what the neoclassicals think is the right way to run a government.
So let's look at the real world, at what happened in the past year, especially in the United States. Trillions and trillions of dollars were printed by the government. This is the first we've seen since the financial crisis of 2008, whereby, it's been the central bank that has been, taking bad assets and putting it on their balance sheet and whatever, games with Wall Street. But this was the first time we've seen during the lockdown where the actual US government issued treasury bonds, trillions of them, and sent them out. The result has been, according to the Fed Reserve data that they release every quarter about household wealth, you see the parabolic increase in wealth from the top 1%. Now, the bottom 50%, their wealth increased by $10,000 household wealth from $4,000 before it. But the likes of, say, Jeff Bezos, his wealth increased by $88 billion last year. Also, Elon Musk, similar amount of money and wealth increase. So, the deficits don't matter, they say. Paul Krugman says debt is just money we owe to ourselves. But speaking of disequilibrium and instability, it seems like this sort of explosion of wealth gap, it seems like that money that they say doesn't exist, it all funnels always to the elite first. And then it never trickles down, especially in an economy like the US, which is just purely financialized. There's no manufacturing, there's no wealth creation, there are no real jobs except for at service sector. So it seems like that system is totally broken and all your models are destroyed.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that the central banks and governments, economists who used to argue that we shouldn't interfere in the market, their main role these days is making sure asset markets don't fall. So that was when they signed when they started doing QE back in 2009 or 10. I commented at the time this was like signing a life away with Mephistopheles. Once you sign on the dotted line, you can't pull out of the contract. And what that has meant is they've literally got involved in driving up asset prices. And on the Mephistopheles point, when they began QE, as you probably remember, the value of the S&P 500 index was 666. So they drove it up from the mark of the devil to over 3,000. It has filled into housing markets and a lot of the markets as well, massively overvalued assets. So they've got, what's actually going on is they have an incredible capacity to create money. If the Treasury has that, the central bank can create reserves for the banking sector and thereby drive up share prices in a roundabout way. But they're doing this all the time and actually amplifying the underlying inequality of capitalism. It was bad enough without their intervention, they've made it worse.
Your criticism of neoclassical economics, and you've got a new book out, The New Economics, a Manifesto, it boils down to the intellectual and academic dishonesty that's masking a system that's just printing too much money and distributing it in a corrupt fashion.
The money should be going to the working class and the middle class.
It's being distributed in a corrupt fashion under the cover or mask of neoclassical economics. Under like Paul Krugman, for example, at the New York Times, he's constantly writing pieces to propagandize what is essentially a broken system. So my question is this. You've got three choices now to rectify the situation, as I see it, and tell me where I'm wrong if I'm wrong. The three choices would be allow for debt defaults. Number two would be to raise rates. And number three would be to revisit exactly what is money, use, for example, a gold standard, come back. Those seem to be the three choices right now. Or is there a fourth choice?
Yeah, the fourth choice is to understand money properly to begin with and then say, we have two ways you can create money in a market economy these days. The government can run a deficit and sell bonds to the banks. If the banks sell bonds to the public, that reduces the amount of money, but that's one way of creating money. And the other is banks lending out more than they get back in repayments. So there's government fiat money and credit money. And Fiat money is actually less dangerous for the public than credit money, because if you get government putting money in your bank account, it's the government that's carrying the apparent debt impact of that, not you. But if you get $100 from a bank, you owe the bank $100, and you can't produce your own money, whereas the government can to service its financial commitments. So for all these reasons, it's dangerous to have too much credit-based money. But what we've let happen in the last 40 years, and neoclassical economists, because they don't understand it, actually encourage the growth of private debt. That means that far too much of our money is credit-based and far too little is fiat-based. And we've also let banks decide who they lend to and why, rather than saying the power to create money is a social license you're granted by the government. You should use that for responsible purposes. Don't finance asset speculation, finance entrepreneurship, finance working capital for corporations. So all that stuff's been left aside. Now, money in that sense has always been a promise, okay, a promise of a third party. And it's just that we'll let the third party promise to do garbage with that power rather than promise to do socially responsible things like fund entrepreneurs, fund business, fund consumers. Instead, they've been funding speculators. And then now we have this crazy situation they're in. It shows what happens when you have people who don't understand a system trying to reform it.
On top of this, we have the global monetary system, which is a US dollar rails system. We have that Triffin dilemma problem of basically the US needs to run these massive deficits. So here we had the government send stimulus checks, thousands and thousands of dollars. US income went up by 20% for that bottom 50% because of all this money. However, it went from their bank to China, because China manufactures everything. So you have the bottom leaking out that way to China, where the top, it accumulates in these asset prices. House prices were up 25% year on year in the United States. Obviously, if the bottom 50% got $10,000 in household wealth now because of the stimulus checks, house prices actually went up 100,000 on average. So it just seems like the US dollar itself is also part of the problem. Like there's some sort of, like, how do you even fix this if there's always that basic underlying disequilibrium in global trade?
Fundamental cause of that was America insisting on being the reserve currency after World War II at Bretton Woods. That was Harry Dexter White, the American representative, overruling Keynes and saying rather than having a specific currency created for international trade called the Bancor, which is what Keynes wanted, use the American dollar. Now, that's like, we're the big guys. We beat the Germans. We should be the reserve currency rather than the British pound, and that's how the Americans saw it. Keynes saw it as a catastrophe because what it meant was you're using a domestic currency for international trade. Now, what that meant was you necessarily have a demand for that country's money over and above the demand for its goods. So consequently, you actually need American dollars for trade. You're going to be driving up the price of American dollars and making it harder for American exporters. And that's what's happened over time. I think you last had a trade surplus back in 1980. And there's been dramatic relocation of production as well by American corporations to China to take advantage of low wages. Now, the Chinese have turned that into making China an industrial powerhouse and building its own major manufacturing corporation. So America has created its latest rival, as usual. Rather than being an enemy this time with one to go and bomb, it's an economy which can outcompete them. And that's the price America is paying for its bravado at the end of the Second World War, wanting to be the reserve currency.
We talk about the money printing and how it puffs up asset prices, which rewards the top 1/10 of 1%. And part of that asset price appreciation has to do with the central bank buying into the bond market. So they buy the bonds off Wall Street banks, junk bonds particularly. And this has the effect of driving interest rates lower. So my question is, as the summer solutions, what if there were parameters that would make it impossible for any of these marauders, these swashbuckling, robber barons, to borrow money for less than 4%. In other words, it's what I call interest rate apartheid. They manipulate interest rates to make it so that if you're a friend of Goldman Sachs, like for example, Louis Vuitton in France bought Tiffany's and they borrowed money from the European Central Bank at 0. right? I can't do that. I can't buy a company at 0% interest rate. So but and it's all political. There's no economics involved there whatsoever. It's a pure political favoritism, right? So what about saying, interest rates we can't allow anyone to borrow money for free, essentially. That's allowing someone to kleptocratically own the entire productive base of the economy for nothing.
There should be a positive interest rate for private borrowers, definitely. But the trouble is, by letting too much private borrowing take place, you've now got a level of debt that if you brought in a 4% rate, you'd bankrupt most of American industry. It's carrying 5 times the level of debt it was back in 1945 when rates were similar to now. So the only way out is to write the debt off, and that's why I'm in favor of what I call a modern debt jubilee, which is one of the things I detail in that book.
So you picked door number 1, reduce debt with a modern debt jubilee. Congratulations, Steve Keen. You win a copy to the New Economics, a Manifesto by Professor Steve Keen. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
You shouldn't have, Max.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. We want to thank our guest, Professor Steve Keen. Until next time, bye, y'all.